Hi, it's Beck here. Today we're going to be working on the Rebecca Page Tote Bag, and I want to specifically show you how I'm going to do the straps, which is a little bit different to the instructions, but for me today this is how I'm going to do it. So instead of stitching a tube and then turning the tube right way out, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the whole of the strap. You can see I've already ironed it or pressed it in half, and next what I'm going to do is I'm going to measure about a half an inch in on each side, fold that over and press that as well. So that mimics the seam allowance allowed for in the pattern. So I've got my gauge, one of my favourite sewing tools. I'm going to set it to a half inch, and then using my gauge and my iron, I'm going to measure in a half inch. I'm going to press it. I'm going to do that all along both long edges. Alright, so you can see here that I've folded over and pressed the long edges 1/2 inch in, and that will mimic the seam allowance called for in the, I nearly said recipe, in the pattern. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to fold it over again in half so that the raw edges are now encased. I'm going to give that another press just to neaten it up. All the way along. These are quite long straps, which is why I'm going to use this method of encasing and stitching flat rather than using the turning inside out method. The turning inside out method is fine for a shorter strap. I mean, it's fine for this too, but it's just a little bit fiddly, and I find this a quicker way to get a nice neat result. And I also quite like the way that the top stitching looks when you're finished. Just sometimes gives a slightly neater, sharper finish. So it really depends on the project that you're working on, the size of the pieces that you're manipulating, and what type of finish you prefer as to whether you use this type of a method or the more traditional stitch a tube and turn it inside out method. So now that I've pressed that, what I'm going to do is take it over to the machine. I'm going to stitch a narrow hem along the folded edge. So here we are at the machine. Now I have my machine thread at the moment with a purple top thread and a sort of steel blue or a grey blue bobbin thread. There's a few different theories around colour matching and thread matching. Some people will always match their thread colour to their fabric. Others will always use a neutral colour like a grey, which will often blend in to the fabric. And then a compromise position is that you use a colour matching thread for the top, for top stitching, and a neutral for the bottom, which is sort of what I'm doing at the moment. So let's have a look. Using a narrow hem, so I'm going to run it so that the folded edges sit just along the side of my foot here. And I'm going to use just a straight running stitch, not a running stitch, but a straight stitch on my machine, and I'm using the default settings for stitch length and width. So here we go. Now I'll just grab my gauge. So as you can see here, because the seam allowance I've used is less than the half inch that we folded in, I'm confident that I have captured the raw edges and that they are safely contained within the seam, so I won't have to worry about fraying. Now, if I had wanted to make this seam narrower, that is the stitching closer to the folded edge, there's a few ways you could do it. My personal preference is to move the needle, and I'm not sure with these colours how effective this video is going to be showing you this. I think you can see the needle there. I'm just going to move it up and down. So at the moment I have my needle set, using the hand crank, have my needle set centered. If I wanted to make this a narrower hem, what I would do is I would use my controls on my machine to move that needle over to the right. And if you can see it going down there, see how that would make it a narrower seam. So I'm just going to pan across and show you where the controls are on my machine. Just pop my needle back up high. And just going to now, for those of you who get a bit queasy with moving cameras, warning, the camera's about to move. So over here on my machine, this is where you see the controls for the length and the width of stitches. And you'll see I've got a little reminder here to myself. This is the settings I like to use when I'm doing zigzag to do a seam rather, or a hem on stretch fabric. Sorry for the wonky cam, that might fix it up. So what I've done is I've moved this all the way over to the right, which has given me that narrower seam. If I wanted it to go all the way to the left, I would go over to the 1. And the middle is about 3.5 or so. If you want to set it back to the default settings, all the way back to the left with your slider, and then what I do, I'm just going to show you the rest of the buttons. I then go to the next row, and then I press the top button, and that takes me back to the straight stitch, and then that will automatically put the needle back in the central default position. So that is how I like to do these longer straps, enclosing that raw edge. You can give it another press when you're done if you like. You also can, if you want to, top stitch the other fold side if you like a balanced symmetrical finish. I don't think I will on this one, but sometimes I do. It depends again on the project and the finish I'm looking for. So I'd love to see what you're working on. Let me know in the comments below. And if you'd like to get your own copy of the pattern that I'm working on today, you'll find a link in the comments and also in the announcements on my Facebook page. Thanks for joining me. I'll talk to you again soon.